The air inside the studio hummed like static before a storm. Cameras panned across a crowd bracing for the familiar clash. Sharp words, political jabs, the kind of spectacle that feeds headlines before fading into cynicism. The host leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Mr. Pompeo," he asked, "what do you make of Representative Jasmine Crockett's latest remarks on accountability in government?" The audience tensed, expecting a smirk, a pivot, another polished deflection. But Pompeo didn't smirk. He exhaled, looked down for a beat, and said quietly, "She's a voice of reason in chaos. We need more like her." The room froze. You could hear someone's pen drop against the desk. Even the host blinked twice, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Then came a wave of gasps, half disbelief, half admiration. Cameras zoomed in, phones lifted. Clips shot skyward before his sentence even landed. On screen, Pompeo's expression held, steady, unflinching, almost humbled. Somewhere backstage, producers mouthed, "Run that back." For a moment, politics itself felt suspended, rewritten in real time. But as the applause rippled through the room, no one expected Jasmine's reply, a response that would flip the entire narrative on its head. Only weeks before that night, Washington had felt like a pressure cooker with no release valve. Committee hearings turned into shouting matches. Pundits built entire careers out of outrage. Every clip that hit the air seemed to confirm the same story. America had stopped listening to itself. Pompeo had been one of the architects of that noise, a man who spoke in certainties and never in concessions. His televised debates were masterclasses in control. Dismissive smiles, sharp retorts, and a tone that said compromise was weakness. So when he uttered those words of praise, it wasn't just surprising, it was seismic. Because across the aisle stood Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman who refused to fit into anyone's script. She didn't temper her fire for approval. She spoke like someone raised on resilience, someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. Her speeches blended policy with poetry, pain with pride, and people noticed. Within months, she'd gone from being underestimated to unavoidable, a new kind of political energy that made even her critics watch with unease. So when Pompeo's compliment broke the airwaves, it didn't sound like diplomacy, it sounded like a confession. But before we celebrate, we have to understand why this praise hit like a thunderclap, and what Pompeo had been saying just months earlier. For years, Mike Pompeo had borne certainty like armor. In the halls of power, his voice carried the clipped rhythm of command, blunt, disciplined, unyielding. Cameras often caught him mid-lecture, chin lifted, eye steady, delivering his truths as though carved in granite. He didn't debate, he declared. To allies, it was strength. To critics, it was arrogance refined into performance. Old clips still circulate, Pompeo brushing off questions about systemic bias, calling progressive reformers idealists without discipline, and smirking at the word equity as if it were a fad. His tone always the same, cool dismissal wrapped in patriotism. When asked once about representation and leadership, he'd replied, "We need capability, not categories." The soundbite landed like a gavel, sealing him as a man who spoke for the old guard, the guardians of the way things were. He thrived in confrontation, the raised eyebrow, the measured pause before a cutting line. These were the gestures of a man who believed he was untouchable. Behind the polished podiums and military posture, his creed was clear: never apologize, never yield, never concede ground to sentiment. For many, that unflinching discipline was the essence of power. And yet, the years had changed the landscape. The rhetoric that once drew applause now felt dated, the confidence misread as denial. Viewers began to crave something else: authenticity, empathy, a flicker of humanity behind the talking points. In this new America, men like Pompeo didn't just represent conservatism. They embodied the fatigue of a nation tired of walls. And as Jasmine Crockett's name began to surface more and more in interviews and headlines, his world, The old order of dominance through decorum started to tremble at its edges. Jasmine Crockett's story began far from marble columns and bright studio lights. Texas heat, long hours, and louder dreams shaped her before Washington ever learned her name. She grew up watching injustice not as theory, but as daily reality. Neighbors over-policed, families unheard, voices discounted because of where they came from or how they sounded. That early fire didn't fade, it focused. Law school became her proving ground, public defense her battlefield. She wasn't drawn to the glamour of politics, but to the raw need for someone willing to stand in the gap. As a public defender, she faced the faces no one else wanted to see. Young men in orange jumpsuits, mothers too tired to hope. Each case carved a deeper sense of purpose. She spoke in courtrooms the way she speaks now in Congress, deliberate, direct, every word earned through struggle. When others raised their voices to dominate, she raised hers to cut through the noise. But Washington has his own way of testing conviction. They underestimated her. They called her too emotional, too loud, too green. Commentators wrapped prejudice in politeness, whispering that she'd broed out. Yet every attack seemed to polish her resolve. Each coded yab became content, each dismissal another viral clip. She turned the nation's casual disrespect into currency. There was that moment in committee, the one that first went viral, when an opponent tried to talk over her, to explain the Constitution to a woman who had defended its most fragile promises. She didn't shout. She leaned in, eyes locked, and replied, "I read the same document you did. The difference is, I still believe in it." The silence that followed was her signature. From there, her rise was relentless. Cable panels began to feature her not as a novelty, but as a force. Grassroots donors, young voters, and immigrants who saw pieces of themselves in her cadence began to rally. She carried not just policy, but presence, proof that authenticity could survive the machinery of politics. So when Pompeo's words came, they didn't just surprise her, they summoned every ounce of the strength that brought her here. The studio felt like a held breath. Every eye fixed on Pompeo as he leaned toward the microphone, his tone disarmingly calm. "You know," he began, "I've disagreed with Representative Crockett more times than I can count, but I'll say this, she speaks with clarity, with conviction. I wish more in Congress cared as much about the truth as she clearly does." The audience shifted, unsure whether to applaud or wait for the catch. The compliment sounded sincere, yet there was an undertone, just enough edge to make people wonder if it was admiration or strategy. The host blinked, eyebrows raised, a smile caught halfway between surprise and skepticism. Pompeo continued, voice smooth as a practiced speech. "In a world where so many chase headlines, she stands her ground. That's rare." Then a pause, deliberate. Even when she's wrong, she's fearless about it. Laughter fluttered from a few corners of the room, nervous and thin. Jasmine didn't move. Her expression was unreadable, her stillness louder than any rebuttal. The camera zoomed in, close enough to catch the gleam in her eyes, the almost imperceptible lift of her chin. Pompeo, sensing the tension, shifted in his seat. "Look, I'm not saying I agree with her politics," he added quickly, "but courage deserves acknowledgement, even across the aisle." The host glanced between them, sensing a moment that could either implode or transform into something unforgettable. The murmurs from the audience grew into an undercurrent of anticipation. Jasmine hadn't spoken. The silence stretched until it became its own dialogue, her calm against his calculation. Every second deepened the suspense. The lights seemed brighter, the air thicker. Viewers at home leaned forward. Was she flattered, offended, ready to dismantle the compliment piece by piece? Pompeo folded his hands, confident but uneasy, as if he'd just stepped into a conversation he no longer controlled. The energy was no longer his, it was hers, coiling, waiting. And then, with a single breath and one piercing sentence, she changed the tone of the entire night. For a heartbeat, Jasmine didn't move. The lights pressed against her face, and the audience waited, suspended between surprise and expectation. She gave a small nod, almost grateful, and said, "Thank you, Secretary Pompeo. Respect means more when it comes after recognition, not resistance." The line landed like a bell, not loud but deep. Pompeo's smile flickered, polite, uncertain. The host leaned back, sensing something unscripted about to unfold. Jasmine's tone stayed gentle, but her words sharpened with precision. You see, respect shouldn't be rare enough to trend. It shouldn't take courage for a man in power to acknowledge a woman's work or a black woman's voice. But here we are calling it progress because the bar has been buried so low we trip over it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh, she's going there." Phones came up again, cameras zooming. She continued, unhurried. "I don't doubt your sincerity, Mr. Pompeo, but I do question the culture that taught us to applaud basic decency as bravery. What we're clapping for tonight, what you just did, should be the floor, not the ceiling." Pompeo's eyes met hers. He nodded slightly, but said nothing. There was no defense to make. She took a breath. "I've been called loud when I'm clear, angry when I'm honest, radical when I'm real. Yet every time I remind myself the volume of truth doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing your ground, even when the floor shakes." The studio was silent except for the faint buzz of the lights. Even the host had stopped moving, caught in the gravity of her rhythm. Jasmine leaned forward just enough for the microphone to catch every syllable. You see, respect shouldn't be rare enough to trend. It shouldn't take courage for a man in power to acknowledge a woman's work, or a black woman's voice. But here we are calling it progress because the bar has been buried so low we trip over it. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh, she's going there." Phones came up again, cameras zooming. She continued, unhurried, "I don't doubt your sincerity, Mr. Pompeo, but I do question the culture that taught us to applaud basic decency as bravery. What we're clapping for tonight, what you just did, should be the floor, not the ceiling." Pompeo's eyes met hers. He nodded slightly, but said nothing. There was no defense to make. She took a breath. "I've been called loud when I'm clear, angry when I'm honest, radical when I'm real. Yet every time I remind myself the volume of truth doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing your ground, even when the floor shakes." The studio was silent except for the faint buzz of the lights. Even the host had stopped moving, caught in the gravity of her rhythm. Jasmine leaned forward just enough for the microphone to catch every syllable. You see, we keep saying America's divided, as if that's the weather, something that just happens to us. But division isn't an accident. It's engineered, maintained, monetized. And every time someone chooses acknowledgement over attack, that's rebellion. Somewhere in the back row applause began to build, hesitant at first, then gathering force. She didn't look away. So if tonight is what reconciliation looks like, if this small act of respect is newsworthy, then maybe that tells us everything about the work still to do. Her voice softened. "You gave me a compliment. I'm giving you a challenge. Let's make moments like this unremarkable." The applause surged. Pompeo, still seated, pressed his lips together and nodded once more. The camera caught the exact second. Humility replaced habit. Cut to audience faces, astonishment, tears, pride. A young woman in the front row miled, "Say that." Someone else whispered, "That's leadership." And then the sound of typing filled the silence, phones glowing in dim light, tweets firing out into the ether. Respect means more when it comes after recognition, not resistance. Hashtag Crockett clarity. She didn't destroy him, she educated him. History just blinked. The host finally spoke, voice trembling between awe and control. Congresswoman Crockett, that was quite a statement. Jasmine faintly smiled. It wasn't a statement. It was a reminder. The words hung there, warm and heavy. For the first time, Pompeo laughed quietly, half self-aware, half relieved. Fair enough, he said. But his tone wasn't defensive. It was almost grateful. In the control room, producers were already clipping the segment. On screens across the country, the video began its ascent, retweeted, remixed, captioned, and celebrated. Within minutes, hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Journalists reached for adjectives: measured, fearless, historic, but none of them quite captured what had just happened. A shift, subtle yet seismic, where strength wore the face of composure. Jasmine gathered her notes, calm as if she had just read the weather. The crowd still buzzed, reluctant to move. Pompeo reached across the table. She shook her hand, not as victor and vanquished, but as two people who had both been seen differently than they had before. The camera panned out. Applause thundered, and in that brief collision of grace and gravity, something changed, not just in the room, but in the rhythm of the country watching. By the time she finished, the studio was on its feet, but the shock waves were only beginning to spread. By sunrise, the internet had already rewritten the night. Clips from the debate flooded every platform, each angle carrying its own headline, its own heartbeat. One post froze on Jasmine's face mid-sentence, captioned, "Respect means more when it comes after recognition, not resistance." It had 1 million views by noon. Another looped the handshake, slow motion, with the tag, hashtag Crockett Clarity, glowing in gold letters. Cable news scrambled to keep up. Morning hosts leaned in over coffee mugs, replaying her words like analysts decoding prophecy. On one network, a conservative commentator sighed, "I don't agree with our politics, but that was powerful." Another scoffed, calling it performative grace. Yet even his tone carried hesitation, as if mocking her might backfire. Celebrities joined in, an actor tweeting, "That's what leadership looks like," a singer reposting her line with a single flame emoji. The clip crossed oceans, subtitled in 6 languages. Comment sections filled with strangers saying the same thing in different tongues. Finally, someone spoke like a grown-up. TikTok flooded with reaction edits. Teenagers stitched her quote over footage of protests, classrooms, family dinners. Hashtags spun off into movements. Hashtag Pompeo moment. Hashtag truth wins. Hashtag lead with respect. Overnight, Jasmine Crockett became more than a headline. She became a mirror, reflecting what people wanted to believe America could still sound like. Journalists tried to frame it as strategy. Activists called it a cultural reset. But online, the emotion was simpler: relief. One viral comment read, "She didn't shout, she didn't humiliate, she just told the truth, and that was enough." Newsrooms replayed the applause again and again, cutting between Pompeo's humbled silence and Jasmine's calm command. It wasn't a takedown, it was a turning point. Dignity, it seemed, had finally gone viral. But for Jasmine, it wasn't about trending, it was about something deeper, reclaiming the idea of respect in American discourse. When the lights dimmed and the studio began to empty, the echo of Jasmine's words lingered longer than the applause. She stood at her podium for a moment, letting the noise fade into something softer, something almost sacred. Cameras still rolled, but her gaze wasn't for them anymore. It was somewhere beyond the lenses, beyond the spectacle. This isn't about parties or applause. She said quietly, her voice steady as a heartbeat, "It's about principle." The crowd stilled again, drawn back into her gravity. There was no performance in her tone now, no politician's polish, just conviction. We can disagree without dishonoring. We can argue without erasing each other, because truth isn't loyal to sides, it's loyal to integrity. The words fell into the room like rain after drought. Pompeo listened, head slightly bowed, hands folded, perhaps realizing that grace, once given freely, disarms more powerfully than anger ever could. Narration threaded through the silence, the kind that belongs to moments history remembers, not for their noise, but for their stillness. What Jasmine had offered wasn't a victory, it was a reminder that respect is not weakness, that strength doesn't have to shout, that clarity can be revolutionary. As the credits prepared to roll, she gathered her papers, the final lines of her speech, hanging in the air like a quiet anthem. Sometimes the loudest revolution isn't a shout. It's calm, unflinching clarity. The audience rose, not in frenzy, but reverence. For once, politics had paused long enough for humanity to breathe. And as the cameras faded, one thing was clear. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning to echo. What began as a routine debate became something no one expected, a moment of respect powerful enough to shake cynicism itself. You watched Mike Pompeo, once the symbol of defiance, lower his guard. You watched Jasmine Crockett, the voice of a new generation, rise not through outrage, but through grace. Together, they reminded us what dialogue could still mean when honesty meets humility. This wasn't just a viral clip, it was proof that courage can sound calm, that conviction can coexist with compassion. If this moment moved you, share it, speak about it, be part of the chorus that refuses to trade dignity for noise. Because moments like this remind us that courage doesn't need volume, it just needs vision.